Good evening, America. It's Dylan Torpy, back again. Stock price is dropping from $64 to $1. Declaring bankruptcy seems to only have one thing written all over it: scandal. Unethical behavior by the second largest telecommunications company in the world. Why, most people ask. Tonight we find out why the CEO of WorldCom will spend the next 25 years in prison. We have a special surprise for you guys tonight. Mr. Jones, a former accountant of WorldCom, will share his perspective on the issues. He will go into detail about Bernie Ebbers, the former co-founder and CEO of WorldCom, before being convicted of fraud and conspiracy due to false financial reporting, where WorldCom falsely reported $3.8 billion in expenses. They falsely inflated their profits, not actually meeting profit projections that they lied about. Ebbers and others' unethical thinking during this period of time, Mr. Jones will shed light on. And without further ado, I want to welcome Enmanuel Jones.
Pleased to be here.
And I know the audience is pleased. So I gave the audience a quick overview, an introduction, obviously, as the show normally goes, but I kind of want to hear your overview on the scandal, just to give the audience a little background before we go into any more detailed questions.
Most definitely. So here we're talking about Bernie Ebbers. He was a CEO for WorldCom who let ambition and greed get the best of him and maybe impair his decision making. So in 1990, when he was first starting, he wanted to just continue to grow his company and grow his product. But upon a halt of the tech industry, a lot of companies slashed their spending on equipment and such things. And so he found himself in a predicament of how he could keep his company growing and how he could keep his wealth growing.
Thank you for your overview. So now I want to start diving in a little more into detailed questions. So what do you think the organization's reaction to these dilemmas were?
Okay, so in my opinion, I believe that the organization took probably the most unethical route they could have possibly taken. And in comes the director of management, Betty Vincent, who was asked by the CEO, Bernie Ebbers, and the CFO, Scott Sullivan, to forge documents that overstated net income through reporting expenses as investments. And so what this caused was to show more profitability in WorldCom than was actually happening and more upside, which caused, in turn, for investors to continue investing in WorldCom, even though it had nowhere near the upside that was being projected in its documents.
So I'm sure initially the shareholders and stakeholders are jubilant.
Mm-hmm.
Business is booming. Everything is great. You're the second largest telecommunications company in the world. You're ahead of a lot of other leading competitors like AT&T, which leads me to my next question on what are the shareholders and stakeholders' reactions during this period of time, before and after?
Certainly. So as you said, the stakeholders initially were ecstatic. So they saw a lot of upside to the investment in WorldCom and could not wait to invest and get a return on their investment. But what happened was that a lot of the employees knew what was going on. So more than the 2-3 people that I mentioned earlier were aware of what was going on, but a lot of them chose to stay silent for a long period of time. And so a lot of the documents that were being handled by financial reporting groups and accounting groups were also incorrect, as they were coming down from Ms. Betty Vincent. And so a lot of these were coming down with inaccuracies that were continued and only progressed by these certain groups. And so the stakeholder to shareholder relationship after the stakeholder and shareholder relationship with WorldCom after the scandal had happened obviously took a downward turn, as a lot of the trust was taken away, and WorldCom ended up having to pay billions of dollars in returns to the people who had invested in their company.
So there's one big overall topic in all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Is it ethical or is it not ethical? So now, out of curiosity and the people's curiosity, what is your view on this? Is it ethical? Is it unethical?
I believe it's certainly unethical. So lying to shareholders and stakeholders, employees, and people who are investing into something that isn't exactly what they think it is certainly unethical behavior, just to maintain the financial prosperity that Mr. Evers was enjoying. And I believe that a lot of people were definitely hurt. A lot of money was stated that obviously was not there. And so I think employees were hurt, and Ms. Vincent was also very hurt. She seemed to be very hurt by the situation, very appalled about her own actions, and had to spend time away from her family as a result of the pressures brought about by the CEO and the CFO. So, I mean, based on all the information that you've read about and everything I've spoken about here today, what would you say is your opinion? What would you have to add?
It's interesting that you asked that, because I deal with situations like this in terms of interviews all the time.
Mm-hmm.
When I look at this situation, and when I look at it in terms of a business perspective, in terms of being a CEO or a CFO, yes, it's great. I can be on the top of the line. I'm leading past other competitors, like big ones like AT&T,
Mm-hmm.
etc. But when it comes down to it, they're not really leading. They didn't really lead. They cheated, and unethically.
Mm-hmm.
So just like the reasons that you just said, it does look good and it feels good amongst the shareholders and the stakeholders for a little bit. But when it comes down to your CEO has 25 years in prison, your CFO, your COO are all in jail, all getting charges. You have accountants also getting in jail.
Millions of dollars lost also.
Exactly. And it's all unethical. So when it comes down to it, we're definitely in the same agreement when that comes down.
Sounds good.
So in general, at the moment when people are, let's commit fraud to get out of the struggle that we are in, or to move in front of our competitors, in terms of being anyone in business, but also a CFO, COO, or CEO, what are several alternatives and responses that WorldCom could have made differently?
Certainly. So I believe Mr. Evers could have taken more of a group thinking approach. So for example, through some research I found that groupthink actually has great benefits in that more people are involved in decision making, whereas I think Mr. Evers most certainly would have needed it, since he was so profit driven and driven to protect and enhance and continue to profit from his empire, which was already bringing in millions of dollars for him every year. And so this drive by himself that went unchecked by any partners or anything like that was what led to the ultimate decision to commit fraud. And certainly ethics training in employees would also have been a huge help, since I mentioned earlier that many employees were aware of what was going on in the company but stayed silent. I think ethics training could have definitely trained people that it's okay to be, for example, a whistleblower who could kind of let any agency know that fraud is being committed or something unethical is taking place in their workplace. And then this would enhance the workplace experience and definitely the ethical decisions that a company makes. But so earlier in the 2000s, I believe that this was not yet so at the forefront of the thinking that the companies were making. And so as it becomes more and more implemented, I think that's something that keeps companies more honest and more inclined to do the right thing.
So it's interesting that you mentioned ethics training, because in former interviews I've also had other people mention the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I've noticed something in terms of normal employees, often when making the change into training, having ethics training,
Mm-hmm.
it's only the normal employees. But also, I've noticed these big mistakes are happening with fraud are amongst the CEO, COO, CFO. So they obviously should also be implemented in this ethics training. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that'll help overcome some of these issues that we've been seeing in companies.
Certainly.
So this brings us into our next and last question.
Mm-hmm.
So describe the relationship between your stakeholders and shareholders after this incident. Like, what specifically was going on in terms of inside the company and right outside, obviously?
Certainly. So, I mean, in terms of stakeholders, some of the employees obviously fear for their jobs, both during and after all the controversy that took place. A lot of them were in a dilemma of how they wanted to proceed and how they wanted to go about responding to what was going on. And obviously, the shareholders were obviously very displeased. A lot of them came calling back for their money, and billions had to be paid off to these shareholders who had invested so much money into the company, as they thought that the return of their investment would be so profitable. And so this is what caused the company to go bankrupt, and obviously the trust was lost between shareholders and stakeholders alike, and the company.
Well, thank you, Enmanuel, for having me.
Pleasure to be here.
Appreciate it. Good night, America.